Hi, thank you so much for attending this webinar. Today, this is going to be the third webinar of a series called Visualforce to LWC, and we are going to see how to work with Salesforce data within Lightning Web Components. My name is Alba Rivas. I am a developer evangelist at Salesforce, and this is my Twitter handle in case that you want to ask me anything on Twitter. Okay, so I've said this webinar is the third one in the series. We already had two. The first one was architecture and coding concepts, and the second one, coding concepts continued. And you can watch the recording on Trailhead Live. You have to go to the recording sections, and instead of filter by featured, you filter by all, and then you can find all the webinars. And we are going to have a fourth one about how to reuse Visualforce within Lightning Web Components or with Lightning Web Components. As Salesforce is a publicly traded company, we use this forward-looking statement slide to tell you that you should make purchases based on the functionality that's currently available, but we are not going to see any beta or pilot features today. If you didn't watch the first two webinars, I'm going to give you a quick summary of them so that you can decide if it's a good idea to watch them. The first one was about web standards. We explained all the web standards in which Lightning Web Components is based. I also explained how to set up and configure your development environment, how to debug Lightning Web Components. Also, I talked about the differences in architecture between Visualforce and Lightning Web Components, a very important topic. And we started talking about coding concepts. What we have tried to do is to extrapolate the concepts that you know from Visualforce to help you learn Lightning Web Components, because there are some similarities and things that you can reuse. And and I think I already said that the second webinar was the completion of the coding concepts topic, right? So today we're going to focus on learning how to work with Salesforce data. This is a especially important subject, and it's very interesting for people who come from Visualforce, because in Visualforce, normally to work with Salesforce data, you use Apex, right? Well, also a standard controller, but normally Apex. And in Lightning Web Components, there are many ways to work with Salesforce data, and it's very important to know the capabilities that each feature provides to choose the best option in any case. So this is a diagram of how Visualforce controller architecture was and how Lightning Web Components controller architecture differs from it. You can see on the left-hand side that in Visualforce, what we had was normally a Visualforce page with the markup, right? We bind that Visualforce page to a standard controller or a custom controller or an extension controller, and normally the methods that you define in Apex is something that you can call from your Visualforce markup, for example using an Apex command button action. In Lightning Web Components, we have something similar to a standard controller, which is Lightning Data Service, but it's much more advanced. It is super performance because it gives you caching capabilities and synchronization capabilities. But we can also use Apex. We are going to see that Apex is not the preferred way to start with. I mean, if you can use Lightning Data Service, your components are going to be much more performant. But in some cases, you do have to use it. Okay, we are going to see all the different use cases in which you can use each of the options. Another big difference here is that you don't call those methods from your Lightning Data Service functions or your Apex methods from the markup. You call them from JavaScript, right? So we always call them from JavaScript, and we always do a server round trip to do that. Well, sorry, not always, because if we are using caching, the server round trip is not down. But I will explain that in detail later. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is the Lightning Data Service. The Lightning Data Service is a service that we have created and that allows you to read, create, update, and delete data. It is created in a very smart way and it's super easy to use. So I recommend you to learn very well how it works and how to use it. The Lightning Data Service contains a set of functions that you can use in JavaScript and that hit some endpoints that are part of the user interface API. This user interface API was created when Salesforce started creating apps that needed to recreate a user interface. For example, the Salesforce One mobile app, right? This user interface API gives you the information of how to create records, for example, the different metadata that you need, the different fields that are part of a layout for a specific user, if there are default values for a field, or if a field is required. But it also gives you capabilities to interact with data, to read data, create data, update data, and delete data, right? This is the CRAD acronym here. Those endpoints are secure. You hit those endpoints using HTTPS, and all the different security layers of the platform are enforced when you hit those endpoints. I mean, if a field, for example, is not visible because of field level security, that field won't be returned by the endpoint. So it's super useful. It also supports things like localization and the different languages. For example, if you have set up your or in a different language for a user. And if you want to read more information about the UI API, I recommend you to take a look at this blog post here. And also, a colleague from my team, Philip Osil, has created a playground that you can clone and deploy, and then you can take a look at the different shapes that the objects that the endpoint returns have, right? If you are interested in that. Okay, so Lightning Data Service are a set of functions that you can import in your Lightning Web Components and that behind the scenes call these endpoints that belong to the user interface API. But they do that in a really smart way, as I said before. Why? Because, well, first, they have a shared cache implemented in the client. That means that if you retrieve a record using the Lightning Data Service, that record is going to be stored on the client cache, and in subsequent times that you need to access that record, the Lightning Data Service is going to avoid doing repetitive calls if the record is already there in the cache. As the cache is shared with other Lightning Web Components on the same page, at the moment it's only on the same page, but we have projects and there is a pilot to extend that to other entry points. So if you have several components in the same page that are using the same record, using the Lightning Data Service, as the cache is shared, the record is going to be retrieved just once, or if a change on the component is not on the record is not needed. Also, the Lightning Data Service has synchronization capabilities. That means that if several components in the same page are working with the same record and one of the components changes that record using lining data service functions, the lining data service functions are going to mark that record as stale in the cache. A new record is going to be retrieved, and the rest of the components of the page are going to be notified about that change and are going to show automatically the new version of the record. So it's super useful. It also has other improvements as progressive load of the records or the duplication of requests. But I think the most important two features are caching and synchronization. So how can you use those lining data service functions? Well, there is a way to use them which is even easier, which is use the base form components. There are 3 base components that are helpful to create forms, like to read a record or create a record update, etc. And these 3 base components have different use cases, and what I have done to explain how they work is to create a repository with some examples. This is the link of the repository if you want to take a look. And I'm going to explain them like in a high level in a second, but if you want to take a look at every single component independently, you can go there and take a look. I'll probably do a webinar which is going to be exclusively about using this base for components in the future. So this is the app that I have created to show you how to use the components. The first one is called Lining Record Form. Lining Record Form is the simplest way to create a form and work with records using the lining data service, because these base form components use the lining data service behind the scenes. So here I'm using the form to read fields, read records, and also to create records and to update records. You have to configure the component in different ways to do it one way or the other. I'm going to show you some of the examples. And the most important thing to understand is that if, for example, here, I'm changing the record, right? Because I need to change it, and this record is using these base form components. Pay attention to this section here. The change is going to be automatically reflected in any other components of the page that use lining data service, directly using the lining data service functions or using the form components as we are doing here. This is super important. So some of the configurations that you can apply is, for example, specify the fields that you want to load for a record. You can specify that I want to load whichever fields. You can also specify a layout. Say, I want to see the compact layout of this record, or I want to see the full layout of this record, and that way all the fields that are going to be retrieved are those that appear in the standard user interface, right? And always respecting the field level security and so on. And there is because the default operation mode is that you have the component and you can edit it and then it enters on edit mode, but there is a way in which you can make it read-only if that's something that you need. And also you can directly configure the component as editable, and that way you can create records and update records. And here I have another example which some people don't know that they can do that with lining record form, which is I want to create a record and I want to populate some of the fields on submit, because there is a hook, is really an event called on Submit, to which you can respond and take a look at the content that is being submitted, and for example assign values to some of the fields if they have not been populated or whatever. You have all this in the repo. I'm going to show you some of the examples. Let me close this. And I'm going to show you the record form read fields, right? Which is the one in which I configure Lightning record form in the simplest way, in the simplest way as possible, right? Setting the specific fields that I wanted to show in the layout. Here I could have say, yes, I want to show name and annual revenue and industry, just specifying the fields separated by comma, but the best practice is always to import the fields from the Salesforce schema module and to create a property with those fields so that referential integrity is respected. The one in which I specified a layout is this one. I said, instead of saying I want to show some fields, I'm saying I want to show all the fields that belong to the compact layout and for which the authenticated user has access. Super useful as well. For example, in this one, which is the update one, I'm configuring the Lightning record form in edit mode, and I'm passing in a record ID. In my examples, I have hard-coded a record ID for simplicity. You will have to change that if you want the recipes to work on your org, but it's super simple. And also, I mentioned that you can respond to events that the component fire. In this case, we are showing a toast when the operation is successful, but you can also execute some logic on submit, for example, and on error. Okay, so we have Lightning record form. Lightning record form allows you to cover a lot of use cases. If you need a bit more customization capabilities, then there are two more components that you can use. One of them is Lightning record view form. It's only for reading records, and the other one is Lightning record edit form, which is only for editing records. So here we are using the view form one, and we are doing things as, for example, showing the record as read-only. We are showing custom layout. So if you remember, with Lightning record form, we didn't specify the way in which the fields are going to be shown. They are always shown with Lightning output field component or with Lightning input field component, depending if it's an output or an input. But here with Lightning record view form and Lightning record edit form, we can use a custom layout and render the fields in whatever way we want to do it. And also here I added an example of how to show parent record data. That's something that you cannot do with Lightning record form. I mean, if you have an account and you want to show information about the account owner, you cannot use the dot notation as you do in Visualforce for that. You have to do something else, and I explain how to do it in this component here. You can see the code in the repo. But as I say, these components give you much more customization capabilities. Then for a creation and modification of records, you can configure those components as well using a custom layout and custom way of rendering the components. Here I have just two simple examples, but there are some other extra things that you can do, as for example, pre-populate a field value. If you want to pre-populate a field value with something that's done in your JavaScript file, then you need to use record edit form. You cannot use Lightning record form for that. And also you can reset the different input fields that come with the component, and this example shows the way to do it. The examples are called in the same way that I'm showing here. For example, this one is record edit form, create and reset, right? If you want to look for it. And also with this record view and record edit form, you can show custom errors. I explain myself. For example, here, if I want to show save an account, I created validation rule that shows an error when the name is less than 3 characters, right? And this is the default way in which the component shows the errors. But here I created a custom implementation of that error, which was a toast message. So you can take a look at that. I'm going to show you just some of the examples. For example, I'm going to show you the one in which we use a custom layout, which is this one. As you can see here, instead of using a line in output field or something similar, I'm just interested on showing the fields in different paragraphs, and I can do that thanks to using this record view form or record edit form against what I can do with just line in record form. And for example, I'm going to show you the one about, let's see, for example, the one that allows you to reset the component. So what you do to reset the component is to, here. What you do is to look for the different input fields that are part of the component and then iterate over them to reset them. So there are many more configuration capabilities in these two components here. But enough talking about base components, and let's continue about the different ways in which you can use Lightning Data Service adapters and functions directly without using base components. Sorry, I forgot to say that there is a table in the documentation. If you don't remember what can you do with each of the components, there is a very handy table in the documentation that you can take a look. Okay, so we said that base components use Lightning Data Service behind the scene, and we saw that in our example, right, in which we modified a record in one of the components and the synchronization happened. But you can use those adapters and functions directly when needed. Remember that it's always easier and faster to use a base components, and if they cover your use case, you have no reason for using a Lightning Data Service adapter or function. But if you need more customization capabilities, then you can do it this way. There are adapters that allow you to read data. For example, the simplest one is called GetRecord. That adapter is a function that you can invoke to get the fields that you need from a specific record. It accepts parameters that let you indicate, for example, the fields that you want to retrieve or the layout, etc. It has more or less the same behavior as the base components for forms. What's especially interesting of these kind of adapters? Well, they allow you to read data, right? And there is a special way to call them so that you don't have to worry about calling, updating the value of what you are trying to show in your component every time that something changes or the cache becomes stale or similar. But there is a service that is going to do that for you. It's really the framework. What we do is that we delegate the invocation control to the framework. So how can we do that? For that, we use a decorator called wire, right? And for example, let's imagine that this is the GetRecord wire adapter. Adapters can be imported from a library which is called UI Record API, right? So let's think that this is the GetRecord wire adapter, but I could use others. And then what you do is that you wire that LDS wire adapter, passing in some parameters, and then you can you can wire that adapter to a property or to a function. But let's focus now on the property case. When you wire an adapter to a property, a link is created between that adapter and that property. And we say that we create a reactive service. Why? Because this service or this link is going to provide new values to that property in several situations, right? One of the situations is when the parameters are set initially. So for example, if I'm using GetRecord, passing a record ID, and I initialize that parameter, the first time that I initialize that parameter, the adapter is going to, the wire service is going to retrieve that record and is going to store it in the property. It also provides new values when those parameters changed. So for example, if I change the value of that record ID, then the wire service is going to provide new values to my property. But also, it's going to provide new values not only when I change things on my end, on my JavaScript file, but also when things changes in the cache. So for example, if a record becomes stale in the cache and a new record needs to be retrieved, the adapter is going to provide that new value to your property as well. And in the case that we saw, the synchronization one, if another component in the page changes the value of that record that lives in the cache, then the adapter is going to provide again a new record to your property, a new value to your property. This is super useful because these properties are reactive, same as track properties or API properties. So every time that the service provides a new value to that property, the component is going to re-render and show the new value, right? It's super useful. As I said, a function can also be decorated instead of a property. What's the difference? Well, in this case, the property is going to receive the new values, and in this case, the function is going to execute every time that we receive a new value. In the case of the property, well, it may happen that there is an error when calling that GetRecord wire adapter, right? So the property is going to contain always two fields. It's going to contain a data field and an error field. And sometimes, as it's a stream of values, right? You receive the values, you can receive a different value every time. So sometimes there will be data and sometimes there will be error. You have to code your component to handle these two use cases. In the case of the function, what you receive is an object that also has a data field and an error field. And what you have to do is to code your function logic to function well when you receive a stream of values. Sometimes you will receive data and sometimes you will receive error, right? We will see an example in a second. Well, indeed, I'm going to show you the example right now. Yeah, so here in the examples, I have two recipes in which I'm showing I'm using the GetRecord wire adapter to decorate a property and the same to decorate a function. And what I did was to use the same custom layout that I had here, but that's not important. The important thing is how you retrieve the records from the database. If we take a look at the code, I'm going to close all this and I'm going to use to open the LDS. It's this one is the property one, and this one is the function one. Okay. So if we take a look at this one, this is the one in which I'm decorating a property, right? What we do is to import the wire adapter from the UI Record API. We also import the different fields that we want the wire adapter to retrieve. Here again, I could use just a list of fields specified using a string, but this is the best practice. So what we do is to say that we want to wire this wire adapter to this property and pass the record ID and fields parameters. Something interesting here is that we are using a dollar symbol here. That dollar symbol means that I want the service to react every time that the value of this property, which is this one defined here, changes. That's the way to define a dynamic parameter and to say the adapter that it needs to react to changes on that parameter. In this example, I'm not changing the parameter, but it's very typical to have cases in which you want to retrieve one record based, for example, on a combo box that the user can select, for example, or other examples that need that dynamic behavior. So every time that any of the use cases I mentioned before happens, the wire adapter is going to provide new values. This works as well in combination with the base components forms. For example, if I create a form using Lightning Record Form and I'm modifying a record, that change is going to be reflected in this component that I'm creating with Lightning Data Service, because behind the scenes they are using the same technology. So once I have the record, remember I told you if the operation is successful, the information or the record itself will come in a property which is called data. So the object that is returned by the UI API endpoint has a specific shape, but sometimes you don't want to remember that shape, right? So what we do here is that we use a function getFieldValue that you can import from the UI Record API module as well to retrieve the field that I want to show from the object that is returned without having to know the implementation details of that object that is returned by the UI API. So this is the best practice, right? You could also do it in the other way, like writing this .record.data.fields .whatever. I don't remember now exactly, but this is the best practice. And then I'm able to show that name field value here and the other field values as well. A best practice as well is to only show the field values if you have data. You can check that accessing the record.data property and show an error panel if there is an error. There is an error panel component in the LWC recipes repo. This is a sample app that contains recipes that show you how to implement very simple use cases in Lightning Web Components, and I recommend you to take a look at that error panel and use it within your apps. So the GetRecord function is we obtain the same result, right? It's this one here, but we are doing it in a different way. In this case, what we do is, instead of decorating a property, we decorate a function. The function receives a parameter, which is the object that will contain the data or the error. And then what is super important when decorating functions is to remember that the function is going to receive a stream of data and it's going to be executed several times. So you have to reset the state of your component if there is data or if there is error, right? It's a best practice to reset the full state of your component in any of the cases, so that you don't end up having properties with a value that you don't expect. Here, to implement this use case that we saw, obviously it's much easier to pick the wire a property function option, this one here, because it's much less code, but in some cases it's going to be less code if you write it down using a function, and that's the reason we provide the two options. And in this case here, we are storing the data and the error in some inner properties that then we can reference in the markup the same way as we did before. Okay, so we have talked about how to read records using linear data series wire adapters. But for creating, updating, and delete records, it doesn't make sense to delegate the control flow to the framework, but to invoke the functions just one time. There are functions to do each of the operations, create, update, and delete, and you import the functions and you control when they are invoked, normally in response to a user action. For example, when I click a button to create a record or whatever. How do you invoke a function imperatively? Well, these functions return a promise because the operation is performed asynchronously. So what you can do is to call the function, passing in the parameters that the function needs, and then pass a callback that will execute when the operation is successful, or a callback that will execute when there is an error. This callback will also catch errors from the then block here. That's how promises work. And you always control, as I said, the moment in which the operations are executed. They are a one-time invocation. Also, I added here two notes because normally when you create or update records, you want to create a form first, and there is a way in which you can get the information of which fields are required, or which fields have default values, or which fields are creatable or updatable by the current user. And you can get that information calling another wire adapter and then create your component that way before calling this LDS function. I'm creating a recipe to include in LWC recipes this week that is going to showcase that. So you can take a look probably soon. So these functions, here in these examples, I have one of the cards. So how to create a record, how to update a record, and how to delete a record. What I did was to pick the same records as I'm using in the different examples. So for example, here, if I change this, you are going to see that the record changes here, right? Because we are using the linear data series in all the cases. And if there was a component built with linear record form on the same page, you will see the same effect. How are these components implemented? So for example, let's take a look at the create record one. This is super simple because the only thing that we do is to import the function from the UI record API, and then we invoke the function as if it was a promise. What indeed it is, defining what's going to happen when the operation is successful. In this case, I'm firing a toast event, but you can do whatever you need to do. And also in the error case, you define a function that will execute if there is an error. In this case, I'm creating a record input manually. This is the shape of the object that the UI API expects. You can take a look at these objects in the documentation or also in the UI API Explorer that I shared with you before, the one that Philip built. But also there are ways in which you can create those record inputs calling wire adapters and functions, which is the new recipe that I mentioned I'm creating at the moment. So bear in mind, this is not like the best practice to do, but I think it's interesting to do it this way so that you understand that this is just an object, a JavaScript plain object that follows the shape that the adapter is expecting. Okay. So we have seen everything about Lightning Data Service, right? There are some cases in which you still need to use Apex. For example, at the moment, the wire adapters and functions that are generally available are useful to work with single records. But if you want to create with lists of records at the moment, the best option is to use Apex, because we have a wire adapter which is GetListUI, which is available, but it's beta. I mean, you can use it, but bear in mind it's beta. So in Apex, so using Apex is kind of similar to what we did in Visualforce. However, there are some things that you are going to change because of the nature of the architecture of Lightning Web Components. So imagine that you had this Apex controller here in Visualforce, right, in which you have some properties defined, because we are accessing those properties on the Visualforce page, and that we have a method that allows you to query accounts and store the value of those accounts in that property, so that in the accounts property, so that in the Visualforce page we can re-render a table, for example, that is using that list of accounts, right? What do I need to do if I want to move that to Lightning Web Components? Well, first thing to know is that the methods must be Aura enabled. This is a decorator or an annotation, I think it's called in Apex. And what it does is to add like functionality to that method and make it available to be used in Lightning components. Optionally, you can mark the method as cacheable. This is interesting when you are going to do read operations. Indeed, if you mark a method as cacheable, DML operations are not going to be allowed within the component. So it's only for read operation. But for read operations, it's super interesting because it's going to improve the performance of your components a lot. The other thing is that you need to make your method static. When something is static, it's also stateless, right? Everything that the method needs to be passed as a parameter, as here. And everything that the method returns needs to be returned by the method. You cannot use instance variables or properties anymore, because that state is not preserved between different calls, right? So this is the conversion that we will have to do if we want to reuse our Apex methods in Lightning Web Components. Is important to know. And then, once you have converted your methods, how do you call them from within a Lightning Web Component? Well, we have seen that to call wire adapters and to call functions, you either use wire to create a reactive service or you call them imperatively. With Apex is the same. Apex methods can behave as a wire adapter or as a function. Normally, we follow the same principle. if we want to do a read operation, it makes sense that we create a reactive service so that we delegate the control of the invocation to the framework, and that I'm notified, or well, the component is notified about any changes in the cache. Right? If the method is cacheable, well, the method needs to be cacheable to be able to use wire. That completely makes sense when you have read operations. When you have create, update, or delete operations, it completely makes sense to invoke the method imperatively and to control yourself that invocation, which is going to be a one-time invocation. You can also invoke a method that reads data imperatively, but if it just reads data, it makes much more sense to use wire. And that's the reason I put this letter here in orange, because you can, but why, right? Why do it? Okay, so what you have to do is to import the methods, the Apex methods in your component, and you do that by importing them from Salesforce Apex, the name of the controller and the name of the method. These are really functions that give you access to the Apex method, right? But it's really a JavaScript function. Okay, and the last thing I wanted to tell you about Apex in Visualforce against Apex in Lightning Web Components is that while in Visualforce you normally use Apex page messages to add messages to the page and have a proper error handling, in Lightning Web Components you have to either let your exceptions arrive the controller or throw a custom exception or one of the exceptions that are available in Apex. So I'm going to show you last example, which is I have here two examples of how to invoke Apex in the two different ways that you can do it, right? And the first example, what we are going to do is to read a list of records while in a property. And in the second example, I'm going to invoke imperatively a method that allows me to create an account, right? And I have this table here as well because I want to show you something. So let's say that I want to create an account. Pay attention at this table and this table, right? I create an account and the two tables have been updated. Why? Because here I'm writing an Apex cacheable method that is returning this list of bears, right? These are, sorry, bears, no, bears. I know, are accounts, sorry, but the one that I'm creating here is a bear company. Anyway, so the recipe here is retrieving that list of accounts. It's storing that list of accounts on the cache. And then I'm creating a new account. If you want this behavior to happen, the one that I did, you have to manually refresh the cache, the Apex cache, after creating the account. What I mean is that the Lightning Data Service cache has nothing to do with the Apex cache, and that the Lightning Data Service functions refresh the Lightning Data Service cache automatically. But if you want to use Apex, you have to do it by yourself. And I'm going to show you the way to do that. So I'm going to close all this and we are going to open the Apex wire first. For the Apex wire, what I did was to create a method in my controller that returns a list of accounts. And I'm wiring the method. If the method receive parameters, then I can pass in the parameters here using a JavaScript object, and then I'm binding that method call to the accounts property and showing the accounts using a Lightning Data Table component, right? By waiting the method, again, I'm creating a reactive service that is going to react every time that a parameter changes or if the record changes in the cache, in the Apex cache, right? What is the way to do that? Well, let's take a look at the other one, which is the Apex imperative. In the Apex is imperative, I have a lining button that calls this function here. And this function calls the create account Apex method. That again is something that I import from my Apex controller. Is this one, sorry, the Apex controller was open here. Yeah, is this one here. I just create a test account. That's the reason it's always the same account, because it's just a test I did. So, okay. So, when that method executes successfully, the then part of the promise is going to execute. And then I'm going to show a toast that this is optional, it's something that I have decided. But what I'm going to do is to refresh the entry that the Apex cache has for this annotated property, decorated property. That means that in this component, I need to call the getAccounts method as well over a property so that I can refresh that. This is, that is the reason I was showing the table here, so that you know if you want to refresh the value returned by an Apex method, in the same component that you want to do that, you need to have that value bound to a property, but that is going to have an effect on every component that is using the same Apex method, right? If you see, I do it again, this one is refreshed as well, and it is happening because in this component I'm forcing the refresh of the Apex entry in the cache. Here I'm showing the table, but I could have not shown it. Great. So, as you have seen, there are many ways in which you can work with data in lining with components. This is a table that summarizes the different options and when to use each of them. And this table is part of a Trailhead module that I'm going to show you in a second. I also show this in the previous webinars. We have created some new resources to help you move from Visualforce to LWC. We have a sample app which is called Visualforce to LWC that shows you how to solve typical patterns that people used to implement in Visualforce, but they are coded both in Visualforce and lining with components, and you have access to the code from the recipes card, and it's very easy to use. And then we have released some Trailhead modules. The first one is a quick start that shows you when and how to use the app. And you have to deploy it and do some changes to the app, and it's fun to do. And then we have two modules that I think are really interesting. The first one especially interesting for the webinar because it's called Lining Web Components and Salesforce Data. Is basically what we saw today, and you have to get your hands on and work with some components to make them retrieve and modify some Salesforce data. This one is generic, it's not for Visualforce developers, but we have also a unit in this module, the Lining Web Components for Visualforce Developers 1, which is dedicated to how to work with Salesforce data from a Visualforce developer perspective. So you can take a look at that one as well, because it's going to give you some extra information. For example, in this webinar, I didn't have time to show you, but you can make a component aware of the record ID in a different way in which you do it in Visualforce, and you have some more information there which I think is going to be useful. Here you have a link to the talk examples and some other Trailhead modules that were out there from some time ago, but I think are interesting for Visualforce developers in general. And that's all. Thank you so much for attending the webinar. If you have any questions, please ask me on Twitter, AlbaSFDC, and hope to see you in the next webinar. Bye bye.